Can I just ask you, like, quick show of hands, how many of you think that technology has been helping democracy, or is good for democracy? Is that it? 3 or 4, 5? Okay. How many of you think it's okay? Good. How many of you think it's generally been quite bad for democracy? Okay. How many of you, probably should have said, how many of you think it's kind of good in some ways and kind of bad in other ways? Yeah, that's sort of everyone. All right, okay. Okay. And that's probably quite a reasonable way of thinking about it, and it sort of depends in which ways it's good, which ways it's bad. But I think the problem is not that it's good nor bad, rather that I talk about it as an incompatibility problem. Essentially, we've spent a long time, decades, centuries even, working out how roughly we can create a broadly not terrible representative democracy that sort of works most of the time. And we've done that in an analog world and an analog age, and then suddenly along comes digital technology and things don't quite seem to fit anymore, they don't work exactly, and that incompatibility is what is causing some tension. And I think that's a better way of thinking about things than saying it's good or bad. And it's not just about our rules or our norms, our regulations, it's also about our expectations as well. And I sometimes think about this. Some of you will remember, like I remember, what we used to have to do to get our photographs developed. I mean, when I think about it and I try and explain it to a 21-year-old, they think, what? You spent how much for 21 what? It seems ludicrous. And it was ludicrous, and even when I think, I don't look back on those days with rose-tinted glasses. I mean, it was annoying when you spent £5.99 for your 21 photos, 3 of which were developed. But I think our democracy was kind of understandably frustrating and annoying, and we lived with it. Because the democracy kind of worked a bit like going to Boots and getting your photographs developed, in its imperfections, its delays, its frustrations. But the world of our sort of consumer life, online on our phones, and the world of our democratic life are getting further and further apart. And that's one way in which this sort of tension, I think, is playing out. Now let's start with the most obvious thing, which is elections. We have an election, I think, coming up soon, right? Possibly. And the story of the last maybe 5 or 10 years, more than any other, that's got people thinking about this, is Cambridge Analytica. Right, boo, everyone's boo. I spent a lot of time working on the Cambridge Analytica story. I covered it for the BBC in this Silicon Valley show that you mentioned in 2017. Got no credit for it whatsoever. The Observer got all the credit. I don't mind, it's fine. But I did look into it in some detail. I interviewed Alexander Nix, the CEO of Cambridge Analytica. I went to the headquarters in San Antonio, Texas, where Cambridge Analytica sat in a room with the Republican Party and execs from Google and Facebook to run their digital campaign. So I know it really well. And I think the way we've thought about that story is quite wrong. The obsession has been over, was there cheating involved in the 2016 election? What were the sinister manipulative techniques, the psychographics, the military-grade profiling that was used to dupe millions of people? And I'm probably the wrong audience to say this, but I think part of that is liberals being unable to understand why so many people voted for Donald Trump. It's easy to blame that, but actually what they were doing, what Cambridge Analytica was doing, was pretty industry standard. Most of the things they did, you know, the profiling of people, the micro-targeting of persuadable voters, the swing voters in key states, using a lot of money, of course, is pretty standard. I think the real story of Cambridge Analytica is this. It's changing, it's an example of how our elections are changing. Think about it this way. If I'd have tried to explain to you in 1997 that in less than 20 years, that was my first election, in less than 20 years, elections will be won and lost on a free social media platform called Facebook, where data is being traded for your attention and you are going to be profiled, and you wouldn't have made any sense to people. It would have been science fiction, impossible. So I want you to think about the Cambridge Analytica story, not about 2016, but maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years from now. How might things look then if we carry on down the same trajectory? Because I think the problem with Cambridge Analytica fundamentally is that the rules that we have for elections just don't work in a world of digital advertising. Basically what they did was they profiled lots of people and tried to sat down with the Republican Party strategists, got their data, worked out who they thought could be a swing voter, found 11 million of them, especially in key swing states, hammered them with $80 million worth of Facebook ads, and I think probably nudged just about as enough into the Trump side. Not particularly sophisticated, really. The problem is we don't really understand these techniques. We don't know the sorts of adverts people see. Now think about this, an election in 20 years from now. The great wave of digitization at the moment, a lot of it is to do with internet-enabled devices. Does anyone here have a smart fridge or a smart coffee machine or a smart baby monitor or a smart lavatory? Probably not, but that's going to be 5 or 10 years down the line. Well, one day, fairly soon, you will. You will, because more and more of our devices are being chipped up to the internet. More and more is collecting data about us. We know this to be true. And one day, I think there's, by the way, going to be a weird, new, interesting inequality in society. Most of us are probably middle class, aren't we, I reckon? It's a fair assumption. Even if we didn't come from the middle class, we've worked our way into the middle class. And I don't know about you, but all of my middle class friends now are obsessed over one thing, which is stopping their children looking at an iPad. There seems to be a strategic war going on with 4-year-olds over how to make sure they don't suffer from too much screen time. And I think we're entering into a strange new inequality where the middle classes and above actually live most of their lives offline. And it's the people that can't afford to live their lives offline that are spending more and more time online, being constantly profiled all the time. Simon Cowell I'm going way off topic here. Simon Cowell recently said that he'd given up his smartphone and he loved it. My attention's back, my focus. I'm not checking my phone constantly. But really all he's actually done is outsourced his smartphone's capabilities to his servants because he doesn't need Deliveroo or Uber or to check his emails because his servants will do it for him. And I think this is where we are heading. But that aside, the default is going to be more and more smart devices. And so it sort of goes without saying that politicians of the future in 20 years' time, they will know what you eat. They will know your caffeine intake. They will know your mood of the day. And so, of course, when you go, for example, to your fridge during an election to prepare your meal, we know that you get annoyed at 7 p.m. because you haven't eaten, because we've been spending the last 10 years cross-referencing your eating behaviour with your social posts. And we also know that people who are slightly, in a slightly rotten mood are far more open to candidates that are tough on law and order. So when you open your fridge to get your meal at 7 p.m, Jacob Rees-Mogg's going to pop out of your fridge with a personalised advert. Not just to you, but to each of you with a different advert. Because the direction of travel is that every single person in this room will receive a unique and different and personalised message to each of you. And those messages will probably be increasingly machine generated, because how else could you do it when everyone's receiving a different message? There's so many millions of us. And so this is the future of our elections. This is how they will look. No more ludicrous than, for example, explaining Cambridge Analytica in 1997. And the question is whether we have the rules in place, the laws, the election laws, the privacy laws in place to make sure people can trust that an election really works properly, that it really represents a kind of reflection of public opinion. The ideal of an election is that everyone sees what everyone else sees. We thrash out the ideas of the day. Much harder when everyone's receiving different messages. Much harder for regulators to check that people aren't receiving lies, and this isn't a left-wing thing or a right-wing thing, because I believe they're all doing it, when there's millions of ads that everyone else sees. You saw during the EU referendum that people were receiving adverts about the EU wanting to ban British people from drinking tea and stuff like that, and we found out about it 1 year later. Much harder to do it when it's not just a billboard ad or a TV ad. It's an incompatibility problem. We just don't have the norms or the rules ready yet. And I can feel like I can kind of apply this to almost any area of life. And I'd give you just one or two other examples and then we'll go. And one is education. We still, I think, live in an age which assumes information scarcity. We have an education system that still is about trying to teach people to live in a world where you don't have a lot of information, piecing things together. But of course, we now live in an age of information overload. I don't know about you, but when I go online, I feel like I'm just overwhelmed with contradictory information all the time. The assumption in the 90s, when all of this really started, was that if we had more information, we'd be more informed, we'd be wiser, we'd be kinder, our politics would be nicer because we'd understand each other better. The problem, of course, is that when humans are just overwhelmed with this information torrent, you can't really process it in any meaningful way. You just have to engage with it emotionally. These guys are on my team, those guys are on that team, this is my squad, that's their squad, and we're just going to scream at each other. This is not the fault of information, but in a sense, it's our fault. We can't really process. I mean, I don't know whether you feel, does anyone here feel like they're in an information, like, echo chamber, where they see the same things constantly? You know, because I don't feel like that. I feel like the opposite. I go online and I feel like everywhere I'm surrounded by crazy people with their crazy ideas, like my aunt on Facebook, posting stuff. I'm always encountering different information. I just don't engage with it in any meaningful way, and I dismiss it because I don't really have time to deal with it because I've got 5,000 other pieces of information flying at me. And that isn't just a question about learning how Google's algorithms work, for example. It's about making sure our education system includes the study of human psychology. Because this, to me, is a question of cognitive bias that we all have and we all need to live in a world of information overload. But you don't learn about cognitive biases when you're, well, at any age, really. So this is about, again, an incompatibility problem with the way our lives are lived and the way our information world works. And I think this is also true of fake news. You know, I spent an awful lot of time with Tommy Robinson from the English Defence League, who you probably are roughly familiar with, and I would watch I really was with him everywhere. I kind of shadowed him around for months, and one of the things I noticed about what he did with his phone, like most millennials, was he's obviously on it all the time, but there's an assumption that all he does is read conspiracy theories and lies, fake news. It's not quite accurate. Actually, what he does is carefully cherry picks lots of often true news stories and puts them all together in an endless flow of information, which allows him to create a plausible, coherent, but wildly misleading view of the world. And that is a lot harder to deal with, and it's not the same as fake news. It's the ability to then tailor your information ecosystem so perfectly, and often obsessionally over one subject, that when someone like me, and I'd say this to Tommy Robinson often, you're being Islamophobic, you're painting all Muslims with the same brush, and he would always say the same thing. He would say, is this Islamophobic? This story on the BBC homepage about the council in Rochdale that didn't investigate accusations of child, is that Islamophobic? What about this story about the refugee in Sweden? This is reported by The Guardian about that refugee in Sweden that did X, Y, and Z. Is that Islamophobic? It's not an irrational fear, is it, Jamie? And then he'd always say to me, your problem, Jamie, is that you are part of the media metropolitan liberal elite that wants to silence the truth. And I didn't even used to have a top knot. I had a normal haircut, and he'd still say it. So it's a lot harder to pierce through these sort of false news, fake news views of the world when they're actually based on a series of carefully cherry-picked true stories. Okay, and I see that as, again, an incompatibility. One final example, because I really prefer to think forward 10 years. Like, where are we heading on the current trajectory with how slow our politics are and our rules are hard to change, and how the technology is changing, to try to imagine where we might be going and the sorts of things we can do now. And one thing I think that's really important is this. Has anyone noticed in the last 3 years how much better your Spotify recommendations have been getting? Am I the only one that's noticed that? I feel like they're really starting to get me. You know what I mean? I'm serious. And the other day, and this isn't one of those fake stories that comedians do about I was in a taxi and this honestly happened to me. Spotify recommended to me U2, and I genuinely felt like quite upset about it because I'd always felt that I was too cool for U2. Oh, I don't like U2. I can't believe Spotify would think that about me. Oh. And then I thought again for a moment, and I thought, maybe I do like U2 though. And all this time I've been lying to myself about it. Why have I been doing that? And it really sort of threw me into a bit of a tailspin about myself and how I live. Like, this was literally a recommendation from Spotify. And I know it's a silly example, but I think it's a wider point. Increasingly, machines will be making important decisions about our lives, whether it's welfare payments, the machine learning algorithms that run the scans, the CT scans, whether it's autonomous vehicles, whether it's CV checkers, lots and lots of decisions made by machines, and they'll be making decisions in ways that we can't fully understand. We don't really know how they've reached certain decisions and why. And I think that will be very, very frustrating for many of us. Some of you may have seen on Twitter a viral going around recently about, it was essentially a racist hand dryer that worked with white hands and then wouldn't work with black hands. We don't know exactly why, but who's held accountable for that? People are being racially discriminated against by a machine, but no one seems to be to blame. Who's to blame? The person that designed the hand dryer in good faith? The person that wrote whatever piece of software was required? It's really difficult to know. You may have heard a story recently, maybe a year and a half ago, with Jeremy Hunt, the health secretary, after it was revealed that a computer algorithm failure had meant that hundreds of thousands of women hadn't received letters about breast scans. And it was reported that several women might have had their lives shortened as a result of this error. And Jeremy Hunt in the House of Commons got up and said the fault was a computer algorithm. And an investigation afterwards found that no one person was to blame. You couldn't really find a person to blame for this. I don't know how many of us are going to accept those kinds of answers when important decisions are made about our lives. We again build systems of responsibility based on people, based on knowing why and how certain decisions are reached, and suddenly we're entering into a time where I'm not sure we're going to be able to do that anymore. And again, we haven't figured out how we create systems of responsibility and accountability with complicated machines. And that's not to blame the machines, but it's to say there's an incompatibility problem again. So all of these different questions, and I think we could cover so many different things, including the cryptocurrency scam that I've been investigating, which is partly a total failure of the regulators as far as I'm concerned. And rather than blame one side or another, just understand it as a tension between two worlds colliding. And at this point, this sort of where it seems to just be starting, this is the point at which we have to start figuring out what we try to do. I think that's about 20 minutes, isn't it? All right, and so with that, I'll stop, and I'd love to hear what you all think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.